to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am joined by my co-hosts, Rick Lee and Devanya Havis. And today, we are going to be talking about decorum. But before we get into that, we're going to get some drink orders and some rants or raves. So, Rick, let me start with you. What are you drinking?
I'm going to have a bee's knees, and today I am raving about Skype. Recently, Microsoft announced that they're ending the life of Skype, and I just think we should all take a step back and notice how much Skype changed our lives and how much we relied on it before Zoom.
Yeah.
I don't know how Skype lost this market, but it was theirs until pandemic. But I just want to remember the ways in which it put me connected with people around the world. It was just an amazing thing, and I'm going to miss you, Skype.
Devanya, what about you?
Well, today I'm going to have another lavender lemonade, and I'm raving about rest. Rest is something that we know we need, but we underestimate the amount of rest required. And I've been reading Tricia Hersey's Rest is Resistance, and it seems like a really good moment to think about rest as a way of resisting, especially given the degree to which we've been wound up about all manner of things. And so I just want to put in a rave for rest as a way to fight the machine of capitalism, and a shout out to Tricia Hersey's Nap Ministry and her book, Rest is Resistance.
As Elmer Fudd would say, West and we waxation at West. Lee, what about you?
Well, I'm going to have a Buffalo Trace on the rocks today, and I am raving about library rats. Recently, I've been reading Elise Graham's new book entitled Book and Dagger: How Scholars and Librarians Became the Unlikely Spies of World War II. And it is an absolutely fascinating read. In it, she tries to recenter the importance of what she calls library rats, basically academics, bookworms, artists, book collectors in espionage work of World War II. And she says even at one point in the book that the war might have been fought on the battlefields, but it was won in the libraries. I really can't tell you how gripping this book is. It's like reading a spy novel, except all the spies are librarians, are library rats. So I want to give a shout out to both this book and Library Rats.
I heard an interview with her recently, and it sounds fascinating. Also, just to point out, a whole lot of philosophers were involved in that, and a whole lot of women.
Yeah, love those rats. Well, today we are talking about decorum, and it seems like this is something that is slipping away very quickly. So how did you want this conversation to go?
I don't know if you all feel this way, but this season we've done an awful lot of concepts and terms that I think are slightly old-fashioned, and in most cases we've managed to come around and say, wait, maybe we should hold on to this. And I'm wondering if decorum isn't one of those, because at least in my life, the term decorum doesn't come up very much, and I only really associate it with Thurston Howell III from Gilligan's Island. So the term itself comes from the Latin word decorus, that means proper or suitable or seemly, and it's the root of our English word decoration. It seems like a very fancy word. So I can imagine saying that there's a certain decorum at the opera or at Buckingham Palace. But we don't really talk about decorum at the local bar. In a positive way, I think decorum, a lot like etiquette, helps lubricate our social relations so that we can live together with really a minimum amount of friction. But since it has to do with what is proper and suitable, the obvious question comes up, according to who? I know it should be whom, but I'm going to break decorum and say according to who, because that's how regular people talk. In this way, I think decorum becomes a kind of gatekeeping function to keep outsiders or even just potentially challenging positions quiet and less transformative than they could be. I looked at Google's Ngram, and it shows that the usage of the word declined pretty steadily from around the 1850s until around the 1950s. And from then on, its usage remained pretty low until fairly recently. There now seems to be an uptick, even if slight, in the usage of the word decorum. I wonder how we can account for this. Is decorum a helpful social convention, or is it only exclusionary? So please take your seats, turn your phones on silent, and remain properly attentive as we talk about decorum. My sister Dave's wife follows someone on Instagram who has started calling Donald Trump Velveeta Voldemort. And I think that's a really great expression because if you think about it, then Musk becomes Malfoy. And I think it's all so fitting. So I'm going to refer to him and the Velveeta Voldemort's meeting in the Oval Office with J.D. Vance and President Zelensky of Ukraine. Decorum broke down on all sides. On one side, I want to say that Zelensky was really badly mistreated. He was treated indecorously. Now, I didn't know this until afterwards, but the reporter who shouted out why Zelensky was not wearing a suit, that guy was Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend. And he's not even really a journalist.
Of course it was.
You know, the Trump administration has taken out real journalists and put in nut jobs like this guy. So as soon as this guy asks why he's not wearing a suit, then J.D. Vance jumps in and says, hey, but you're not thankful enough to the U.S. for everything we've been doing for you. And then immediately the Velveeta Voldemort jumps on board to say that Zelensky has no cards to play. It's a frickin' war. And Trump is saying you have no cards to play. Now, that behavior on the part of Trump and Vance was inappropriate, improper, unseemly, and wrong. That is, I want to say it wasn't decorous. It was a break of decorum. Now, the other side is the way that the boyfriend playing reporter used decorum to police Zelensky. Why aren't you wearing a suit? So both sides are claiming a break in decorum. Is this term useful for understanding what went on there? What did Trump and Vance do that was so wrong? And why was it wrong?
I kept thinking about this from the standpoint of the decorum demanded of a host. As a Southerner, the requirements of hosting someone, namely that it is part of your duty to make someone feel at home, to feel comfortable. And people kept talking about Zelensky's inappropriate behavior, and I kept asking myself, what behavior becomes the person who is hosting? There is a decorum to hosting as well. And for me, that was where the breakdown occurred. It is incumbent upon a host to go to lengths to make a guest feel comfortable.
In that case, is it a breakdown in decorum or a breakdown in hospitality?
I thought both.
So decorum is a responsibility of hospitality.
Yes. And on the opposite side, a guest has a certain decorum.
Sure.
But that presumes that the guest understands the expectations ahead of time. Like, did they say all men must be wearing suits? Or everyone must be wearing suits?
Right, except Musk.
Yeah.
Well, I think this truly gross display that we saw in the Oval Office in this meeting was maybe just the most blatant example of how decorum is used as a weapon of power. This is most clear because only a week before, we saw another meeting in the Oval Office with Elon Musk standing beside Trump's desk with his toddler running all over the place and acting a fool, wearing a t-shirt and a baseball cap indoors in the Oval Office. So this idea even that there was some decorum broken on Zelensky's part by not wearing a suit is just absolutely ridiculous. Nobody had any problem with Elon Musk's attire when Elon Musk was in the Oval Office. And by the way, Elon Musk is not in the middle of a war.
Right.
I mean, he thinks he's in the middle of a war, but he is not in the middle of a war.
No, I was just going to say, for those old school folks, recall when it was decorum for men to remove hats indoors.
Those were the good old days, Devanya.
Take off your baseball cap, take off your hat indoors. for people who grew up with that or who were trained in that way, seeing someone holding a press conference in a baseball cap in the Oval Office is a genuine breach in decorum. And I just wanted to re-emphasize that because I know maybe for the younger generation, wearing a baseball cap indoors has become more commonplace and is not seen as this great breach.
Yeah, and for whatever it's worth, I don't really have a dog in this fight about dress codes and things like that. But I do recognize that there's a certain kind of respect that we pay to the office of the president. What I was wanting to point out was how this most recent display was the last in a very long line of breaks in decorum. And I'm thinking back to 2009 when Representative Joe Wilson very famously shouted out during President Obama's address to Congress. He shouted out, "You lie." Mm-hmm. Then only a couple years ago when Jamal Bowman was censured for pulling a fire alarm before a vote and people arguing that he violated congressional decorum by doing that. Not to mention, it's just dangerous. But this, again, is just part of a real shift that we've seen, largely fronted by Donald Trump, whose presidency has always challenged, not just his presidency, but his campaigning and his presidency have repeatedly challenged expectations of decorum, including his use of social media, to the way that he was disruptive in his debate performances, name calling, and just a general kind of erosion of respect for other people, including his supporters. You know, he likes them dumb, as they say. So I wonder if we can really just point to him as the problem here.
Well, that's why when you, Lee, were saying before, you don't really have truck with the term decorum, I think I want to hold on to it or something very close to it, because I want to say to Trump and Vance, you broke decorum. At the very least, you broke the norms of hospitality or you were inhospitable. I want to say something that marks a rupture in what normally holds our society together.
See, I want to say you disrespected someone or you were inhospitable to someone or something else, something other than decorum. Because I think one of the things that we've seen is that we've abandoned in some ways the real offense there, which was not that you broke some code of decorum. The real offense there was that you disrespected someone else, or you were inhospitable to someone else, or you didn't act morally responsibly towards someone else. And I'm worried because in as much as we on the left say, yeah, we need the standards of decorum righted again, then we're going to miss all of those other ways that the right has picked up this language of decorum. And I'm thinking here of the way that Serena Williams got blasted all over the place for apparently breaking decorum in her expressions of frustration on the tennis court. Colin Kaepernick got blasted because of his breaking of decorum by kneeling at the national anthem. Even when you think about probably the last bastion of decorum, the English royal family, right? Who got blasted for Harry and Meghan's breaking of decorum? Meghan did.
Right.
So I think that there is deep racialized power relations that are being masked by this language of decorum.
I see what you're saying, Lee. And I think if I could connect this up with something you said earlier, namely you pointed to the Senate and the House of Representatives. They have decorum written in their rules.
Yeah.
It's a violation of their rules to break decorum, and they use that language. And then you think about, okay, when does this come up? And the first thing that came to my mind was, and yet she persisted. That moment when Elizabeth Warren was censured and removed from the Senate floor because she persisted in reading a letter from Coretta Scott King. I don't hear claims that you've broken decorum against idiot dudes who shout out at Obama's State of the Union address or all the other really nasty stuff that goes on the House and Senate floor. On the other hand, and I know you don't like two hands, and maybe this is why you're more willing to give up decorum than I do. On the other hand, there is something that is conventional. It's place dependent, that we all observe in order to make our relations go more smoothly, go without friction, go without breaking down. And I don't know what to call that except decorum.
When I was growing up, we called it home training.
Yeah. Where were you raised? A barn?
But part of understanding how to relate to other people, how to comport oneself, and I'm not arguing that respectability wasn't oftentimes a piece of that, but I would think part of the contention or the beef with decorum is its use to police gender, class, and race.
Yeah.
And I think professionalism is sometimes used in this way, that someone is not being professional if they do not comport themselves in a particular way. And I
Right.
know with respect to hairstyles 5-10 years ago that somehow wearing a braided hairstyle was not considered professional for Black women, but having relaxed hair was considered more professional. And these are ways of subtly enforcing social standards that are not necessarily about respect or justice. They are ways of policing who gets in, who gets to stay, and who is taken seriously in spaces. That is different than the kind of thing that you're talking about, Rick, which is norms of behavior that ensure that people are respected, that people are heard, and that when we come to, for example, a classroom, learning happens. I think of decorum in a classroom. It exists not so that the professor can be the dictator, but so that people conduct themselves in ways that the business of being in class can take part.
I think you're getting to exactly the root of my problem with the emphasis on decorum. So putting aside dress codes and things like that, when we're just talking about, as you both were describing, norms of behavior that make it possible for our interactions with one another to be, as Rick said, frictionless or as frictionless as possible. I think what we forget when we focus on decorum is that whether they're written or not, we have rules of decorum for some other reason. They're not self-justifying.
Right.
We say we need to act in this kind of way so that we can learn, so that we can have productive conversations, so that we're not disrespecting our colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. And when we point at the break in decorum as the problem and not why that break in decorum was a rule of decorum in the first place, then I believe that we're actually missing the point and we're kind of handing over the advantage of the argument to people who want to use rules of decorum to exclude. Because we all agree there are times, even when we might agree with the rules of decorum, for example, in a congressional hearing or in a classroom or in a department meeting, like we don't oppose the rules of decorum. But we realize that there are times when it's justified to break them, when they should be broken. And how do we make that distinction? We say, all right, we have these rules of decorum that are meant to ensure respect, but now they need to be broken to ensure respect.
I think a good example of this is Zelensky not wearing a suit. Afterwards, he said, and maybe he even said it during that heated conversation because he got talked over and so on.
Yeah.
But he said, I'd be happy to wear a suit the moment my country is not in a state of war.
Yeah.
That is something I can understand and maybe not even a break of decorum. Now, that being said, I always laugh that the time the Catholic Pope went to Cuba, Fidel Castro put on a suit. It was the first time in my entire life I ever saw Castro in a suit. I think he heard his mom's voice in the back of his head. Like, Fidel, it's the Papa. You got to wear a suit for the Papa.
I think, as I recall, Zelensky said, I will put on a costume, whatever you want, and
That's
maybe even a nicer suit than the one you're wearing.
Yeah.
To the guy who was yelling, why don't you wear a suit?
Right.
And I think that goes to Lee's point. This focus on a suit when people are dying seems to be the wrong emphasis. And I thought that break of decorum, that clapback was about my people are dying. Can we focus on that as the issue, not what I've got on my body? It's not indecent. It's not offensive unless one wants to make it offensive.
Right. I mean, he didn't have a T-shirt on that said, fuck you, Trump.
Yeah.
He just had the basic uniform he's been wearing ever since the war started. But I want to tease apart two separate issues. On the one hand...
Here come the hands.
All right, two separate issues. And each issue has three sub-issues. No, two separate issues. Issue one is what one might call the arbitrary application of so-called rules of decorum, or the application of rules of decorum that were not known and not made public.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is the way in which, for example, women in a department meeting will be said to be breaking decorum when the same behavior they are called on when it's performed by men is not a break in decorum. So that's an arbitrary application of a rule or the application of a rule that isn't known. I want to separate that out from the fact that decorum as such is always gatekeeping and always used to keep away challenging voices, radical voices, or transformative voices.
I mean, I don't know that I fully agree with that last point. I do think that often decorum is used to allow for everyone to be able to speak. So it's not necessarily to keep out transformative voices, but it is always the case that when rules of decorum are broken, it's because someone is being, as you say, radical. Maybe not transformative, but definitely radical. I was also thinking about, I can't remember what the event was, but there was a time, and it must have been a State of the Union address, when Trump went to give his State of the Union address and he wouldn't shake Speaker Pelosi's hand.
Right.
There was also the time when Speaker Pelosi literally ripped up the text of the State of the Union address immediately following Trump's delivery of it. Both of those are obvious breaks in decorum. I think that they are the same in that both of them were meant to indicate a disrespect, from Trump toward Pelosi and from Pelosi toward Trump. But I do believe that Pelosi's disrespect was about the content of the speech and not so much the person, Trump. Whereas Trump not shaking her hand was about her as a person.
Right. When I looked into the House and Senate rules about decorum, one of the things that is said about the reason for having a rule about decorum is so that the body, either the House or the Senate, discusses issues and topics and content and doesn't discuss individuals, doesn't get into ad hominem attacks and outright disrespect for the sake of disrespecting.
Yeah, this actually did happen quite recently in a congressional hearing, and I wish I could remember the senator's name, but one of the senators or representatives was using the term tranny in talking about LGBTQ issues, and one of her colleagues called her on it and asked the chair to strike that from the record because he said that it was a breach of decorum, and the chair said, well, I'm not up on what all the terms are and I don't even understand pronouns. And so basically, I'm just going to let this ride. There, I think it was explained. It was clearly explained. This is disrespectful. It needs to be stricken from the record for that reason. You know what? If you want to come back later and make an argument that this is not a disrespectful term, then, people can use it in the future. But there was no reason not to enforce decorum rules in that sense, I think.
Sure. Can I just go on record as saying that every rant or rave I have from now until the end of the Trump administration is predicated on my ranting about how every Republican now is acting like a frickin' unfrozen caveman lawyer. Like, I don't get your new modern ways of talking about gender, but...
Pronouns? What? Me no understand pronouns.
Right.
It seems to me that if someone calls out a particular line of conversation as disrespectful, whether you understand it or not, decorum would make it incumbent upon you to pause and take into consideration what that person is saying.
Exactly right.
I cannot appreciate that one requires an extensive database in order to hear a person say, I find this comment in this moment in the way it is being presented to be disrespectful.
I think, Devanya, you just gave what I would consider to be the general and basic rule of decorum. Namely, that when someone feels disrespected, decorum is the demand that they be listened to, and that one behaves in a different way, speaks in a different way out of respect, or to reassert respect. I couldn't think of a better definition of or reason for decorum than that.
And I suppose what I would say is there's no need for any mention of decorum at all in that.
Right.
You could just say, these are the rules of respect. That's why we have rules of decorum, in order to enforce certain expectations about respect.
Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun.
We've already mentioned some of the negative sides of decorum. That is what we've been calling, or I've been calling, the policing functions of decorum. I want to tease that out a little bit more, but before we do, let me just ask straightforwardly, and this is getting to, I think, the crux of what Lee just said, namely, aren't there just some things that are inappropriate and that we should call them out, and that means they're a break in decorum?
For me, that gets tricky because, again, who is the who that determines what is indecorous? That's why I brought up hospitality. There are certain kinds of respect that we owe people, especially when we are inviting them into our domain, be it as a guest of the White House, a guest in my home, or a guest speaker in a department, a guest anywhere. And among them is that we don't ridicule them for what they're wearing. That there's a presumption that they have come putting their best appearance forward, whatever it is. It's a kind of class policing. You ought to be wearing X or Y. Well, maybe one can't afford to wear X or Y, and therefore we have a kind of faith that the person shows up looking as best they can. That's just something I don't want to challenge as a host.
I do think that there are instances that I could imagine where someone would intentionally disrespect the hospitality that I'm extending by on purpose showing up, just to use your example, underdressed. If I showed up to someone's funeral or someone's wedding in shorts and a hoodie and track shoes, I think that there would be reason for people to feel disrespected by that. And I can't imagine any situation in which I would do that without meaning to disrespect somebody. It is the case, you're right, that there will be situations where someone doesn't have a suit, can't afford a suit. But that's not what we're talking about in this case with Zelensky. Zelensky was trying to make a statement by wearing this uniform that he's been wearing since the invasion of Ukraine and since he's been the leader. And I think the response to him was inhospitable because, A, there had already been people in the Oval Office not wearing suits, see Elon Musk.
Right.
B, there was no expectation, really shouldn't have been any expectation on anybody's part that he's going to wear anything different than he's been wearing for the last several years. And C, that they publicly shamed him about it, tried to publicly shame him about it.
Well, this is my point about publicly shaming someone because of what they're wearing. And I would say in the case of a funeral as a host, most people don't yell out in front of all assembled at the funeral, hey, you got on a hoodie and shorts.
Right.
Where I grew up, you would pull them to the side and ask about their home training.
Mhm.
That's not a public calling out. And this is what I mean about invitations and hospitality, because I think part of it began with a conversation about you're invited into the Oval Office. Don't you have respect for being invited here? And I want to say, don't we have a certain duty of care as a host? That seemed to not be a part of the conversation on decorum, which led me to ask, what is the point of this? In other words, why are people doubling down on someone not being thankful, on someone not being appropriately dressed? And I know often people get ridiculed for breaking rules that they may or may not be aware of. And I'm not saying this is in the case of Zelensky, but I am saying back to this notion of decorum as a mode of policing, people are often policed around norms that they are not aware of.
Okay, here's a dirty little secret about me, but I'm a fan of the column Miss Manners. And one of the things I love about Miss Manners is that whenever someone writes in and says, someone did such and such a thing, should I have said something to them? Her answer is always, that was wrong that they did that, and no, you should not have said anything. In other words, in her opinion, it is always a breach of manners to point out a breach of manners, especially publicly. And so I agree with you, Devanya, that one break in decorum was the public announcement of a break in decorum. If you think about Buckingham Palace, this would never happen there. Why? Because they have like 500 people, one of whom would pull aside the person who's breaking decorum and say, "Sir, we have a whole room of suits over there. His Majesty requires that you put one on." And it would have been taken care of quietly. And the guest who may not have known would feel better about themselves for not having been called out and for being able to follow then this rule of decorum. And so I think it is always a break in decorum to announce publicly a break in decorum.
And I know there have been cases where the demands of manners are not followed, and in order not to disrespect a guest, people will follow along in that inappropriate conduct. I, of course, can't cite it, but there was a case where someone did not wash their fingers in the finger bowl, which was a huge breach in etiquette, and one of the queens did it as well so as not to call attention to the guest who made that etiquette faux pas.
Right.
At the risk of sounding like the most indecorous person in this conversation, I do want us to go back, though, to instances where the break in the rules of decorum is meant to solicit a response.
Yes.
The purpose of it is to be called out for breaking decorum. You know, it's hard for me to think of situations in which there are rules of decorum and those rules of decorum are not primarily instituted in order to mark the strata of power, the different strata of power. And so, for example, if you're in a courtroom and the judge walks in, everybody stands up. It doesn't matter if you respect that judge in particular or not. Those are the rules of decorum that we respect the judge. Mm-hmm. But that's also true of the national anthem. Mm-hmm. And so when you're at a ball game and you sit during the national anthem or you kneel during the national anthem, you are intending for people to see it. You are wanting to solicit a response in that break of the rules of decorum. And so my worry about Miss Manners' advice that we should never call out breaches of decorum is that just reinvests the people who already have the power with even more power.
Well, I think Miss Manners is saying we don't, in the moment, go up to that person and shake our fingers as the school marm and say, "You're breaking decorum."
But let me give you another example. Let's say I'm in a department meeting, and for the last 12 department meetings in a row, every single time I've been asked to take the minutes.
Right.
And then now there's a department meeting and the chairperson says to me, "Lee, can you take the minutes?" And I just say, "No, I won't." I want them to say why. I don't want them to wait until after the meeting and say, "That was a little bit out of order. You shouldn't do that when you're asked. Everyone else does it." I want somebody to say, "Why not?" So that I can say, because every single time a woman takes the minutes and I am not a secretary, I am also one of your colleagues.
But I think being surprised by a break in decorum, then wondering or even asking why, is entirely different than pointing out publicly just for the sake of pointing it out that this is a break in decorum. In other words, had the chair said to you something like, "You've broken a rule of decorum, you need to leave the meeting," that would be publicly pointing out your break in the rule of decorum. I also agree with you that without rules of decorum, there would be no power in resistance that is brought about by violating the rules of decorum.
Right.
You know, as Adorno says once in Negative Dialectics, the world is as dialectical as that.
And I do think there is a power in people seeing this deviation from the rule of decorum. And I want to go back to your example of Kaepernick kneeling. Kaepernick kneeled long before people started commenting on the fact that he was kneeling. And in fact, Kaepernick consulted athletes who were activists about the most respectful way to not engage in the national anthem as a form of protest, and was told that kneeling would be the most decorous way to offer a kind of protest.
That's exactly what concerns me, is that even protests of rules of decorum themselves have to be decorous.
I don't think they have to be decorous. I think there are different ways of describing behavior that seeks to be, in your words, respectful. How do I resist? In this case, the national anthem, because I believe that my country has become tyrannical.
Right.
And I want to point that out, not by disrespecting my country, but by saying my country has not achieved the kinds of goals that I expect it to be engaged in. How do I do that respectfully while also lodging my disagreement? And I think that's the issue.
And I think that asking the question, how do I do that respectfully, is prioritizing decorum over respect.
Can you say more?
I mean, obviously, I can't speak for Kaepernick, but I think that there were many Black athletes at the time who didn't respect the country. The way that, for example, police brutality had exploded. I mean, it's always been here, but had exploded and had become more visible in the public space and was being ignored, was being downplayed. There was no reason to ask, how do I protest the way that this country treats Black people respectfully? What we were trying to show is that there is a deep disrespect happening to Black people in the United States. If I say, okay, but how do I make that point respectfully? That, again, I think is prioritizing decorum over what I think is the real problem, which was disrespect.
I see that, but if you belong to a social group that is always policed around issues of decorum, part of the strategy in doing it respectfully is so that the breach of decorum does not become the focus.
How did that work out for Kaepernick? Because what do we talk about? We talked about his breach of decorum. We did not talk about the violence.
Well, people talked about his breach of decorum, but I think people did talk at length about the violence. And frankly, it was one of those moments that made me. And mind you, I used to watch NFL every Sunday for decades. And with the Kaepernick thing, for me, it was the first time that I stopped watching the NFL because people focused on the issue of decorum and not the reasons that he was choosing to kneel, or the fact that numerous people started to kneel. NFL organizations then wanted to fine players for exercising their First Amendment rights. And so I do think there were larger conversations about it that extended beyond decorum. But I think decorum was a way to putter away the larger conversation.
I agree with you, but I think those larger conversations that went beyond decorum were happening among people for whom Kaepernick's kneeling, they were not the target audience. The people who were the target audience of the kneeling still only talked about the breach of decorum.
And I wonder if there's any way to bring along people who couldn't see the veracity of Kaepernick's argument, or put a different way, are there certain ears that one cannot reach because they are not open to listening? Decorum becomes an excuse for the refusal to listen, which is, as I think Rick said, indecorous.
It just might be the case that there is a way to reach those ears, but it's by not being polite about it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do our best to act decorously. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the emphasis on decorum over the reasons that we have rules of decorum worries me.
This is such a tough knot we're pulling on here, because on the one hand, I want to agree with you, Lee, that one of the problems with decorum is any violation of it becomes about a violation of decorum and not about the reason for that violation. On the other hand, I think all of us have said that we do not want to live in a world where there is no decorum.
But when we say we do not want to live in a world that has no decorum, what we mean by that is we want to live in a world where everyone respects one another, where everyone treats everyone else the way that everyone ought to treat everyone, right? I mean, it's just, it's a categorical imperative. In a world like that, we would need no rules of decorum. Agreed?
No.
I don't.
I think rules of decorum involve respect, but I think they're broader than respect, too. They're often about how social engagements or social interactions can run smoothly. I don't want to lose sight of the way in which you're pointing out the power dynamics of those. I don't think they are absent power dynamics. Rules of decorum are often unevenly applied.
I'm trying to think of a rule of decorum or a set of rules of decorum that, just to put it straightforwardly, don't have some kind of moral ground. And if there are such rules, it wouldn't make any difference in our world if we had that decorum or didn't have that decorum. If we lived in an alternative universe where people always wore ball caps inside or wore hoodies and shorts to funerals, like who cares? That would just be a different world. It wouldn't actually matter. But if we lived in a world in which people broke the rules of decorum that have to do with what I think you've been saying all along, both of you, the kinds of things that make society function, that make it possible for us to live with one another well, then I think we'd have problems. But the focus on decorum is missing the point. What we want is a world in which people respect one another, a world in which we understand that we have to work together for the common good, that we may be different and that we may disagree, but we ought to do it in certain kinds of ways.
And only in those ways is your objection.
No, because I think a person who cares about decorum would say, and only in those ways. What I'm saying is, ultimately, the reason that we have certain rules about how one ought to, for example, negotiate disagreements is because there's some underlying moral reason for those rules. Now, again, there are other rules of decorum that have nothing to do with morality at all. They just have to do with customs and practices and fashion and all kinds of things. But for the important ones, they have some kind of underlying moral reason. And I think that the focus on decorum and not on the underlying moral reason for the rules of decorum is the misstep.
I think Lee is speaking to a particular ethical basis around respect of persons and respecting people so that we are not committing injustice. Decorum has been linked to those standards. And I hear Lee saying, let's just talk about the ethical reasons that we hold these standards without throwing decorum in the mix. Why do we need decorum?
I would put it somewhat differently. The world in which everyone just respects one another, that may be a world in which we don't need decorum, but it would be a world in which there are no humans. What I see as rules of decorum are ways in which respect can be demanded, even among those who don't realize they're being disrespectful or what it would take to respect someone. In other words, I think if I say to someone, be respectful, that's not enough for them to know in every situation what to do and what not to do. And so I take decorum to be the sort of rules of application of respect in various contexts, at various times, in various cultures. And so to get very philosophically technical about it, a world in which there are no humans, that would be a world in which there are no duties. But Kant writes a book, The Metaphysics of Morals, which is all about duties. Why? Because he wants to have a set of rules that show specific applications of what would be the general moral law, because it's not always clear at all times to humans what they should do in this case, in that case, and in another case. And so to say that that's all grounded in morality or ethics, yes, for sure. But I take rules of decorum to be ways of saying, I don't need you to know all the time that you're being disrespectful. I do need you to know you're violating this rule. Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
All right, well, I want to quibble with some of the things that Rick said at the end of that last segment.
That was very decorous, Lee.
Well, thank you. So first of all, I want to say I do get your point now when you said earlier that in a world where everybody respected each other, there would be no need for decorum. I don't agree with your statement that a world where everyone respected one another would be a world without humans. I'm not sure that I follow exactly how that works, but let's leave that aside for just a moment. What I want to say is that Kant's articulation of the moral law in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and in his larger second critique is not about giving us rules of action.
Right.
It's about showing us how there is a formal structure to anything that is going to be moral,
Right.
anything that's going to be respectful, that is going to be dutiful, however you want to phrase that. And so when you said, it's sometimes the case that people don't even know that they're being disrespectful. And so what decorum does is it says, all right, because you don't understand it, here's a set of rules. I think that is the exact wrong way to go about it. If somebody doesn't understand respect, what I don't need to do is give them a set of rules for what counts as respectful or what doesn't count as respectful. What I need to do is help them understand what respect is. That's what I think Kant is doing in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and in his moral philosophy. He's not giving us a 10 commandments. He's not saying, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't covet your neighbor's ass. He's saying anything that you do that is morally good is going to have this form. If he gave us a set of rules, that would be decorum. That would not be morality, I think.
Is it the case, and perhaps I think so, that often one wants to express respect, but might not know the means by which to express that respect outwardly?
I'm stipulating all of these things as realities of human behavior, but fixing that by saying, here's a set of behavioral rules is not fixing it. It's just creating people who follow these rules of decorum, which means that it's creating people who are deferential and who are not moral.
I hear that danger. It is worth pointing out that you began this by saying, I want to quibble with you, and not, Jesus Christ, Rick, you're fucking full of shit.
I was trying to respectfully disagree.
By the way, I'm pretty sure you and I have been in a bar before in which you may have said those exact words to me.
Yeah, for sure.
But I will guarantee that I was probably full of shit at the time you said that. So the reason I point that out is because for me to explain to someone who comes to my house for dinner why their break in decorum is disrespectful either to me or to someone else is a kind of break in decorum itself. I don't think it's helpful or appropriate at that time. And I think that rules of decorum are a shorthand for that. And even when you don't know exactly how to default back to a different position in which you're respecting someone anyhow, even though you don't know exactly how and so on, at best, the ideal form of rules of decorum are shorthand ways providing for respect in ways that I don't have to take someone aside and give them a moral education from the ground up. Like, I don't want to have to take someone through the Nicomachean Ethics and then go to Kant and show why that's different than Aristotle's ethics and then why utilitarianism is bogus and stupid and wrong and so on. I just want them right now to be respectful.
Yeah, I think I agree, but that seems a little bit at odds with what I've been hearing you say, which is that when somebody breaks these rules of decorum, that moment is not the moment to correct them. If it is the case that these rules of decorum are just a shorthand, the cliff notes for the longer philosophical discussion that you're going to have with me later for being such an asshole, then it seems like that would be exactly the time to do it. Let me give you an example.
Can I just make a small clarification?
Sure.
I didn't say they shouldn't be corrected. I said they shouldn't be corrected publicly.
Okay, I'm going to use the same example then.
Okay, good.
Let's say the three of us are at my house for dinner, and I have a friend who is a trans man who's also at that dinner, and then there's a fifth person. And the fifth person continues repeatedly to dead name my friend, to use the wrong pronouns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Obviously, that person needs a much longer lesson in respect and a much longer lesson in understanding why misgendering someone is disrespectful. But I'm not going to have that whole conversation right then. But I am definitely not going to let the whole night go with this person doing this, no more than I would let the whole night go if I had a black man at my table and a white man was calling him boy all night.
Yeah.
I would not just say, all right, well, yeah, you're breaking decorum here, but later is the time for us to pick this up. That is actually the one kind of useful thing about decorum, is that we can address it right now, just as a rule. And then later, we're going to have a conversation about it so that you won't need the rule explained to you again.
So I don't know why I think this, but I would say that none of those examples you gave are violations of decorum. In the same way that I don't think stealing is a violation of decorum or murder is a violation of decorum. There are offenses that are not about decorum, not about what is fitting and suitable and proper. Those are different kinds of both ethical and political violations. Okay, maybe they're violations also of decorum, but that's like saying that I have a knife in my chest and the problem is my shirt is stained.
Okay, well, let's say that my friend is calling you Ricky all night. I would interrupt and I would say right then, that's not what he wants to be called. He's explained it several times already. Stop calling him that.
Yeah, I mean, if I have explained it, yes, then for sure.
Okay, but that's not, you having a knife in your chest. That's not at the level of misgendering someone or using racial slurs or anything like that. But I just don't see this impetus to wait.
Well, I think the distinction is calling out violations of decorum in ways that disrespect the person who is being indecorous. And I think that's a balance. I don't necessarily alleviate the problem of disrespect by calling out a person in a disrespectful way.
Obviously, yeah, obviously.
And I think that for me is at issue. And it's not so much that I ignore that they are committing an offense as much as it is, how do I approach that offense? I want to link that to a point we were discussing earlier about who gets called out for being in violation of rules of decorum. And typically, someone who is publicly called out for breaking rules of decorum is being policed or managed by power structures. And so I want to distinguish that from the ways in which I have seen things handled when you want to teach someone or to educate them about what is improper about their behavior in ways that have a lasting effect without having to go through a whole ethical roll call, so to speak. I don't need to yell out, hey, you're not wearing a suit, or hey, you're not dressed properly for this. I can pull them aside and have a conversation.
Yeah, I think it goes without saying that one ought not to impart either rules or lessons about disrespectfully. I mean, that just seems like obvious.
But I think the underside of the point that I'm trying to make here is that decorum becomes the plot villain when it's not necessarily the real villain. And it strikes me that that's part of what, Lee, you've been bringing up, that we focus on the breach of decorum when in fact there are these other breaches that are the real villain. So what happened prior to the breach of the decorum?
Yes, that's been my point all along. Yes.
No, and I agree.
I am sympathetic to that, but I'm concerned that when we move away from some of the basic rules of decorum, people will be disrespected on the face. And I'm not as confident about that message being heard. And for that reason, I'm not entirely willing to throw out decorum. And it's not because I disagree with you. I just think that there have got to be strategic uses of decorum for resistance in the way that decorum is strategically used to buttress the status quo.
I think I largely agree with everything that you just said. I suppose maybe I would just want to correct the argument that I've been making throughout this conversation to say that I'm also not interested in throwing out decorum. I might be interested in throwing out conversations about decorum. It's the emphasis on decorum that I find frustrating and actually not only not getting to the heart of the issue, but in fact impeding real discussion of what the real problems are.
I went into this conversation thinking I want to save a certain kind of decorum. And, for a few days I've been playing in my mind with a democratic decorum or something like that. And through this conversation, I came to realize, actually, maybe we should just throw it out. But you saved me there at the end, Lee. I could not possibly agree more. I want to hold on to a certain kind of decorum, but I agree with you. I want to stop talking about it in the sense of pointing out, this is decorum, this is a breach of decorum. The problem is you broke decorum, and so on. Here. Thank you for bringing that clarity.
Yes.
Well, at this point, I think I'm going to take my elbows off the table and put my shoes back on because the bartender is giving us last call, and I don't want a third breach of decorum while I'm sitting here at her bar. This has been really great, and I'm sorry to have been so ornery and broken some of the rules of decorum in this podcast, but I really do appreciate you guys hearing me out.
Well, I didn't hear one breach of decorum, and even though you think it, you never once said that I'm full of shit.
And I think there is something decorous about your willingness to engage through the friction of conversation. And I think doing that respectfully and in ways that appreciate that we have different perspectives and different points of view is at the heart of why we want to hold on to something like decorum, but not necessarily talk about violations of decorum.
I also just want to say to our listeners that we try to model on this podcast the fact that disagreement all by itself is not the same as disrespect.
Right.
We can have conversations like this that sound a little heated, that sound like we're taking jabs, that may break some rules of decorum, but maintain at their heart a respect for one another and a respect for the truth. And I hope that that was communicated clearly enough in this episode. I know I speak for my co-host when I say it's very important to all of us.
Here.
Yes.
All right, get out of here, assholes.